Prince Henry VIII didn't just die. He decomposed for years before his heart finally stopped beating. By the time death actually came for him, there wasn't much left worth taking. Picture a man whose waist measured 54 inches. That's bigger than most people stand tall. At nearly 400 pounds, Henry had become something that barely resembled a human being anymore. But the weight wasn't the worst part. Not even close. His legs were covered in massive, festering wounds that never healed. These weren't small cuts or minor injuries. We're talking about deep ulcers that oozed pus and rotted flesh continuously, day after day, year after year. The smell was so overpowering that courtiers would hold perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when they had to approach the king. Some historical accounts describe the stench as being detectable from several rooms away. Servants actually drew straws to determine who would have to help dress him. Getting close to those wounds was considered a form of punishment. Imagine the most powerful man in England, and nobody wanted to get within arm's reach of him because the smell of his rotting legs was that unbearable. The royal physicians tried everything. They packed the wounds with different substances, applied countless ointments, wrapped them in special bandages. Nothing worked. The ulcers just kept festering, kept oozing, kept spreading that horrific smell throughout whatever palace Henry occupied. But here's what makes this truly disturbing. Henry wasn't some elderly man at the end of a long life. He was in his 40s when his body started this grotesque rebellion. The athletic young prince who once dazzled Europe with his jousting skills had transformed into a mountain of rotting flesh that could barely move without assistance. Modern medical experts believe Henry suffered from a severe traumatic brain injury after a jousting accident in 1536. This wasn't just a bump on the head. The king was unconscious for 2 hours, which in medieval terms meant he was practically dead. His horse had fallen on him, crushing him under hundreds of pounds of armor and horseflesh. When Henry finally woke up, something fundamental had changed. The personality shift was dramatic and immediate. The relatively reasonable young king disappeared, replaced by the paranoid, rage-filled monster that history remembers. That jousting accident didn't just injure Henry's body. It killed whatever humanity he had left. The brain injury likely caused massive personality changes, but it also probably contributed to something else. Medical historians now suspect Henry developed Cushing syndrome, a condition that would explain his dramatic weight gain, violent mood swings, and those horrific leg ulcers that refused to heal. His own doctors suspected something was seriously wrong, but they were too terrified to say anything. Criticizing the king's health was considered treason. So they watched in silence as their monarch's body slowly fell apart, knowing that speaking the truth would get them executed. By his final years, Henry couldn't even control his own bowel movements. Royal attendants had to carry special chairs everywhere he went, because the king could barely make it from room to room without having an accident. Picture that for a moment. The man who claimed divine right to rule, who executed people for looking at him the wrong way, couldn't even control when he shit himself. The courtiers pretended not to notice. The servants cleaned up the messes without comment. Everyone maintained the fiction that this rotting, incontinent mountain of flesh was still a majestic king worthy of respect and fear. But the smell told a different story. That constant, unavoidable stench of decomposing flesh announced the truth that nobody dared speak out loud. Henry VIII was already dead. His body just hadn't figured it out yet, and the rotting exterior was only the beginning of the horror. Before 1536, Henry VIII was actually likable. Hard to believe given what he became, but the young king was athletic, intelligent, and relatively reasonable by royal standards. He wrote music, played multiple instruments, spoke several languages fluently, and could outride and outfight most men in his court. Then came January 24th, 1536. The day that changed everything. Henry was jousting at Greenwich Palace, showing off as usual. He was 44 years old, but still convinced he was the athletic young champion he'd been 2 decades earlier. His opponent was a much younger knight, and Henry was wearing heavy armor that added significant weight to his already substantial frame. The collision was catastrophic. Henry's horse stumbled and fell, throwing the king to the ground. Then the horse, weighed down by its own armor, fell directly on top of him. The combined weight of horse and armor crushed Henry into the dirt. For 2 hours he didn't move, didn't speak, barely breathed. His wife, Anne Boleyn, who was pregnant at the time, was told her husband was dead. The entire court went into panic mode, preparing for the succession crisis that would follow the king's death. But Henry didn't die. Not physically, anyway. When he finally regained consciousness, those around him probably wished he had stayed dead, because the Henry who woke up was not the same man who had mounted that horse. Something had broken inside his skull, and it wasn't just bone. The medical understanding of traumatic brain injury was non-existent in 1536. Nobody understood that Henry's brain had been severely damaged, that the tissue had been bruised and torn, that the pathways controlling personality and emotion had been permanently altered. All they knew was that the king had changed. The mood swings became extreme and unpredictable. One moment, he would be laughing and generous. The next, screaming in murderous rage over nothing. His paranoia intensified to levels that made everyone around him nervous for their lives. His treatment of Anne Boleyn became noticeably crueler after the accident. Within months, he had her arrested on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason. Within a year, she was dead, beheaded on Tower Green, while Henry planned his wedding to his next victim. But the personality changes weren't the only consequence. The accident seems to have triggered or worsened a condition that modern doctors recognize as Cushing's syndrome. This disorder affects the body's hormone production, leading to rapid weight gain, muscle weakness, and skin problems. It also causes wounds to heal slowly, or not at all, which explains those festering leg ulcers that would torment Henry for the rest of his life. The weight gain was dramatic and rapid. Within a few years of the accident, Henry had ballooned from a muscular 200 pounds to well over 300. By the end of his life, he would top 400 pounds, most of it concentrated around his midsection and creating that infamous 54-inch waist. His legs, already damaged from decades of jousting injuries, couldn't support the weight. The old wounds reopened and refused to close. New ulcers formed. The flesh around these wounds became infected and necrotic, essentially rotting while he was still alive. Henry's physicians tried everything their medieval medical knowledge could devise. They drained the wounds, packed them with various substances, applied leeches to draw out the bad blood. Nothing worked because they didn't understand the underlying cause. They were treating symptoms of a hormonal disorder with techniques designed for simple infections. The pain must have been constant and excruciating. Infected wounds hurt. Rotting flesh hurts. Carrying 400 pounds on legs covered in open sores hurts. But Henry couldn't show weakness. Kings didn't complain about pain. So he suffered in silence, and that suffering twisted his personality even further. The mood swings got worse. The paranoia deepened. The cruelty became more extreme. People started walking on eggshells around him, never knowing which version of the king they would encounter on any given day. His doctors knew something was catastrophically wrong, but they were trapped. Telling the king he was seriously ill would be interpreted as criticism, possibly treason. So they prescribed useless treatments, offered empty reassurances, and watched their patient deteriorate while praying they wouldn't be blamed when he finally died. Meanwhile, Henry became convinced that his health problems were someone else's fault. Maybe his wives weren't praying hard enough for him. Maybe there were traitors at court cursing him. Maybe God was punishing him for some unknown sin. The idea that his own body was simply failing never occurred to him, or if it did, he refused to accept it. By the 1540s, Henry needed mechanical assistance just to move around. A specially designed chair with wheels and pulleys allowed servants to transport their increasingly immobile king from room to room. Getting him upstairs required multiple strong men and elaborate pulley systems. But as his body failed, his mind descended into something far more dangerous. The brain-damaged, pain-ridden, paranoid king still had absolute power over everyone around him. And he was about to use that power in ways that would make his early cruelties look merciful by comparison. The rotting body was just the visible manifestation of what was happening inside Henry's damaged brain. and everyone close to him was about to discover just how dangerous a decomposing tyrant could be. Everyone knows Henry VIII had 6 wives and executed 2 of them. But the reality of what those women endured goes far beyond a simple beheading. Henry didn't just kill his wives. He psychologically tortured them first, breaking them down piece by piece before finally ending their lives. Anne Boleyn's execution is famous, but the lead-up to it reveals the true depths of Henry's cruelty. When the king decided he wanted to be rid of her, he didn't just have her arrested. He orchestrated an elaborate frame-up that destroyed everyone around her first. Henry had Anne's own musician arrested and tortured until he confessed to having an affair with the Queen. The confession was obviously false, extracted under extreme duress, but it gave Henry what he needed. Then he arrested 4 more men, including Anne's own brother George, on similar charges. Here's the truly sick part. Henry made Anne watch as all 5 men were executed. She had to stand there, knowing she was next, watching innocent people die because of her husband's paranoid fantasies. They were beheaded one by one while she waited in the tower, counting down the hours until her own death. One of the men was a close friend. Another was a court musician who had simply played music in her presence. Her brother George was probably the closest person to her in the world, and Henry made her live with the knowledge that they all died because he wanted a new wife. The executions took place on May 17th, 1536. Anne was killed 2 days later. Those 2 days must have been pure psychological torture, knowing exactly when you're going to die, knowing that everyone you cared about is already dead, knowing that your husband orchestrated all of it because he was bored with you. But Anne Boleyn got off easy compared to Catherine Howard. Catherine was basically a teenager when Henry married her. She was somewhere between 16 and 19 years old. Sources disagree on her exact age. Henry was 49, morbidly obese, covered in festering wounds, and probably smelled like a rotting corpse. The marriage was a nightmare from the start. When Henry discovered that Catherine had been sexually active before their marriage, he didn't just execute her. He passed a new law first. The law made it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their complete sexual history. He changed the entire legal system because his teenage wife wasn't a virgin. Think about that level of petty cruelty. Catherine was already facing execution, but that wasn't enough for Henry. He needed to make sure that what happened to her could happen to any future wife who dared to have a past. Catherine was executed on February 13th, 1542. She was so terrified that she asked to practice laying her head on the block the night before. A 19-year-old girl spent her final hours rehearsing her own beheading because she was too scared to mess it up. But the psychological games were the worst part of Henry's treatment of his wives. He would shower them with gifts and affection one day, then completely ignore them or threaten them the next. The mood swings kept everyone off balance, never knowing which version of the king they would encounter. Catherine of Aragon spent her final years essentially under house arrest. Henry forbade her from seeing her daughter Mary, spreading rumors that Catherine was mentally ill to justify keeping them apart. She died alone at Kimbolton Castle in January 1536, possibly poisoned, writing letters to Henry that he never bothered to read. Henry actually forced his wives to sign documents, agreeing to their own divorces or annulments. Anne of Cleves was so terrified of him that she agreed to a fake marriage annulment just to avoid execution. She had to pretend their marriage never happened and thank Henry for the privilege of not being murdered. The testimony from her annulment proceedings was humiliating. She had to publicly discuss the most intimate details of her wedding night, admitting that the marriage was never consummated. Royal officials questioned her about whether Henry's body had functioned properly, whether she had done something wrong, whether the failure was her fault. Anne of Cleves agreed to everything. She signed every document, gave every testimony they demanded, and thanked Henry profusely for dissolving their marriage. Because she understood that the alternative was having her head cut off like Anne Boleyn. Then there was Jane Seymour, the only wife who died of natural causes. She died from complications after giving birth to Henry's long-awaited son Edward. The birth was difficult, probably made worse by medieval medical incompetence, and Jane developed an infection that killed her within 2 weeks. Henry was already eyeing up his next wife before Jane's body was cold. He waited exactly 9 days after her funeral to start planning his next marriage. 9 days. That's how long he mourned the woman who had finally given him the male heir he desperately wanted. The cruelest aspect of all this is that these women had absolutely no escape. Divorce wasn't an option unless Henry wanted it. Running away meant death for them and probably their families. Fighting back meant execution. Complying with his demands meant living in constant fear of his changing moods. Henry's rotting body made the situation even more grotesque. By the time he married Catherine Howard, he could barely walk. His leg wounds were so infected that they leaked constantly. His clothes had to be changed multiple times a day because of the discharge. The smell was overwhelming. Imagine being a teenage girl forced to share a bed with that. Being expected to act like it was an honor. Having to pretend you weren't disgusted every time he touched you. And if you failed to hide your revulsion, if you showed even a moment of hesitation or disgust, you risked ending up like Anne Boleyn, watching your friends die before your own execution. These women weren't just victims of execution. They were victims of prolonged psychological warfare, conducted by a man whose damaged brain and rotting body had turned him into something barely human. A monster who still wielded absolute power over everyone around him. But while Henry was busy torturing his wives, his own body was preparing an even more grotesque rebellion. One that would turn his final years into a living nightmare that made his wives' suffering look almost merciful by comparison. Henry VIII's paranoia wasn't just typical royal suspicion. This man turned his entire kingdom into a surveillance state that would impress modern dictators. By his final years, Henry was so convinced that everyone was plotting against him that he transformed royal life into a living nightmare for everyone around him. Let's start with his sleeping arrangements, because they reveal just how deep his paranoia ran. Henry slept with loaded crossbows positioned next to his bed, not for decoration. These were functional weapons, ready to fire at any perceived threat. But crossbows weren't enough. He kept multiple daggers under his pillow within easy reach, sharp blades that he could grab instantly if he sensed danger in the darkness. And still, that wasn't enough to make him feel safe. Henry also stationed armed guards inside his bedroom, watching him sleep all night. Not outside the door, inside the room. Multiple men with weapons, standing there in the darkness, watching their king's massive body struggle to breathe through the night. Imagine being so terrified of assassination that you couldn't even close your eyes without witnesses. That's not normal royal caution. That's clinical paranoia born from a brain injury and years of unchecked power. The palace itself became a fortress of fear. Henry ordered the construction of secret passages throughout every building he lived in. Not for romantic trysts or convenient shortcuts. These passages existed so he could escape if assassins came for him. Every palace had hidden exits, concealed doorways, and passages known only to the king and his most trusted servants. He had peepholes installed in walls throughout the palaces, small holes that allowed him to spy on his own courtiers without their knowledge. Conversations that people thought were private were actually being observed by the king himself, watching from hidden vantage points. Listening devices were hidden in meeting rooms. Primitive by modern standards, but effective enough. Hollow tubes built into walls that carried sound from one room to another, allowing Henry to eavesdrop on conversations he wasn't supposed to hear. But here's where it gets truly insane. Henry created an entire network of spies whose job was to spy on his other spies. He had informants watching his informants, creating this twisted web of surveillance where nobody knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological horror show. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you executed. Everyone was suspicious of everyone else. Friendships were dangerous because your friend might be reporting your conversations to the king. Family members turned on each other to prove their loyalty. The food paranoia reached absolutely ridiculous levels. Henry already had multiple food tasters, but he required his meals to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens with guards watching every step of the cooking process. The salt had to be tested by one person, the spices tested by another. Even the water required a separate tester. Each ingredient went through its own approval process before it could be used in the king's food. and after the food was prepared, the tasters had to wait 30 minutes after eating before Henry would touch anything. He wanted to make sure they didn't drop dead from slow-acting poison, so every meal was delayed by at least half an hour while he watched his tasters to see if they started showing symptoms. Eating a simple meal became a military operation involving dozens of people and taking hours to complete. All because Henry was convinced someone was trying to poison him. The man even suspected his own children of plotting against him. He had spies watching Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, his own daughters. These were children, and he treated them like enemy agents in their own home. Mary, his daughter with Catherine of Aragon, was constantly monitored. Her letters were read, her conversations reported, her movements tracked. Henry was convinced she resented him for how he treated her mother, which was probably true, and he feared she might try to overthrow him. Elizabeth, his daughter with Anne Boleyn, faced similar surveillance. Even as a child, she lived under constant observation, knowing that anything she said or did might be reported to her father and interpreted as treason. Henry's paranoia got so extreme that he started executing people for crimes they hadn't even committed yet. He would have someone killed because he dreamed they betrayed him, or because someone else suggested they might be disloyal in the future. The Tower of London was constantly full of people whose only crime was existing near Henry while he was in one of his paranoid moods. Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry's most loyal and effective advisors, was executed partly because Henry became convinced he was too powerful. Cromwell had served the king faithfully for years, but eventually his competence made him a threat. Henry had him beheaded on charges that were largely fabricated. The same pattern repeated throughout Henry's reign. Loyal servants would work tirelessly for the king, only to be executed when Henry's paranoia fixed on them as potential threats. Nobody was safe, no matter how loyal they had been. The truly terrifying part is that Henry's paranoia was so contagious that it infected his entire court. Nobles started spying on each other, hoping to be the first to report potential treason. Servants betrayed their masters for imaginary rewards. Everyone lived in constant fear that they would be the next victim of the king's delusional suspicions. Court officials began keeping detailed records of every conversation, every meeting, every interaction. Not for historical purposes, but for self-protection. They needed proof of their loyalty in case Henry decided to accuse them of treason. The paranoia extended to his medical care. Henry's physicians lived in constant terror of being blamed for his deteriorating health. They prescribed useless treatments and offered empty reassurances because suggesting the king was seriously ill could be interpreted as treason. So they watched him rot, watched the leg wounds fester and spread, watched his weight balloon to grotesque proportions, watched his mind deteriorate further, and they said nothing, because telling the truth would get them killed. By the end of his life, Henry had created a kingdom where everyone was afraid of everyone else, where trust was impossible, where the only certainty was that the king might have you executed at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. But while Henry was building this empire of fear, his body was preparing its own form of rebellion. The rotting flesh, the failing organs, the accumulating damage from years of obesity and infection, all of it was building toward a finale so grotesque that even his paranoid imagination couldn't have predicted it. By 1547, Henry VIII had become something that barely qualified as alive. His body had transformed into a grotesque monument to decay, a walking demonstration of what happens when flesh refuses to die, even as it rots from within. Henry was so massive that he couldn't walk anymore, not even with assistance. His legs, covered in those festering ulcers that had tormented him for over a decade, simply couldn't support the weight of his 400-pound frame. So his servants had to carry him everywhere using a specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels. It took multiple strong men to move the king from room to room. The chair itself was a feat of engineering, built specifically to handle the weight of England's decomposing monarch. But here's the disgusting part that historical records actually document. His leg wounds had become so infected that pieces of rotting flesh would literally fall off his body as they moved him. Servants had to follow behind the king's chair with cloths, cleaning up the chunks of decomposing tissue that dropped onto the palace floors. bits of their king, actual pieces of royal flesh, falling off like meat from an overcooked roast. The smell had become so overwhelming that even his doctors, men who had spent years dealing with medieval medical horrors, had trouble staying in the same room with him. The stench of rotting flesh mixed with the smell of infection, sweat, and the inevitable results of Henry's incontinence. Because yes, by this point, Henry could barely control his bowel movements. Royal attendants carried special chairs into every room he visited, portable commodes that allowed the king to relieve himself without having to move far. But even with these accommodations, accidents were frequent. Picture the most powerful man in England, the supreme head of the church, the king who claimed to rule by divine right, sitting in his own waste because his body had betrayed him so completely that he couldn't even make it to a chamber pot in time. The courtiers maintained the fiction. They pretended not to notice. They acted like the smell was normal, like the chunks of flesh falling from their king's legs were just another aspect of royal life. Everyone played along because the alternative was acknowledging that their king was already dead, just too stubborn to stop breathing. Henry's final weeks were a descent into pure physical horror. His body had swollen to grotesque proportions, not from fat alone, but from the accumulation of fluids his failing organs could no longer process. His skin stretched tight and shiny, giving him an almost translucent appearance. The leg ulcers had grown so large that they merged into vast areas of exposed, rotting tissue. The infection had spread deep into the muscle and possibly into the bone. Modern doctors, looking at the historical descriptions, believe Henry was suffering from osteomyelitis, a bone infection that causes excruciating pain and progressive tissue death. He could barely speak anymore. The same brain damage that had transformed his personality was now affecting his basic functions. His words came out slurred and confused. Sometimes he would drift in and out of consciousness, his damaged brain unable to maintain awareness. His heart, working overtime to pump blood through 400 pounds of tissue, was failing. His lungs, compressed by his massive weight, struggled to provide enough oxygen. His kidneys, overwhelmed by infection and disease, were shutting down. But Henry kept living. His body refused to quit even as every system failed. It was as if his sheer stubbornness, the same pig-headed determination that had allowed him to execute wives and destroy anyone who opposed him, was keeping him alive past any reasonable stopping point. The death scene was like something from a horror story. Henry's body had swollen so much that his skin was stretched to the point of breaking. The smell emanating from him was so foul that even his most loyal servants had to leave the room to vomit. His breathing came in wet, labored gasps. Each breath sounded like it might be his last, but somehow he kept going. The death rattle that physicians had been expecting for days just wouldn't come. When he finally died on January 28, 1547, at around 2 a.m, nobody wanted to get close enough to officially confirm it. The smell was that bad. The sight was that horrible. This mass of rotting flesh that used to be a king had finally stopped moving, and everyone was too disgusted or terrified to approach. It took hours before anyone worked up the courage to formally announce that the king was dead. They had to be absolutely certain, because approaching a living Henry uninvited could still technically be treason, even if that Henry was more corpse than man. But death, it turned out, was just the beginning of Henry's final humiliation. His body had one last grotesque surprise prepared, one final demonstration that no amount of royal power could overcome the basic laws of decomposition. And what happened next would shock everyone who witnessed it, creating a legend of horror that would be whispered about for generations. Henry VIII was dead, but his body wasn't finished causing chaos. The royal physicians and morticians who had to prepare the corpse for burial faced a task that none of them were remotely prepared for. The body was massive, bloated beyond recognition, and actively decomposing. Henry had been dead for less than a day, but the process of decay was already well advanced. All those infections, all that rotting tissue that had been barely contained while he was alive, now had free rein. They wrapped his corpse in lead sheets, a standard practice for royal burials designed to contain the smell and slow decomposition. Then they sealed this lead-wrapped mass in a wooden coffin. Then they put that coffin inside another wooden box, creating multiple layers of containment. They thought this would be enough. They were very, very wrong. The funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle was scheduled to take several days. Henry's body, sealed in its reinforced coffin, was placed on an elaborate hearse, and the journey began. But something was happening inside that coffin. Something that nobody had anticipated or planned for. Henry's body was decomposing rapidly, much faster than a normal corpse. All those infections, all that rotting tissue, all the bacteria that had been feasting on his flesh while he was still alive, they were now working overtime. And as bacteria consume flesh, they produce gas, lots of gas. The pressure inside the coffin was building. The lead wrapping contained the expanding body for a while, but lead can only stretch so far before it tears. The wooden coffin held together for a bit longer, but wood is even less forgiving than lead. During the funeral procession, somewhere between London and Windsor, the inevitable happened. The coffin exploded. Not a small crack or a minor leak. The built-up pressure from decomposition gases was so intense that it ruptured the lead lining and burst through the wooden coffin. Rotting royal remains splattered all over the inside of the hearse. The smell was so horrific that the funeral procession had to stop immediately. Servants and officials stumbled out of the hearse, gagging and vomiting from the stench of exploded king. The carefully planned royal funeral had turned into a disaster scene. They had to clean up the mess right there on the road. Servants brought buckets and rags, trying to gather up the pieces of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin. Fluids, decomposing tissue, bits of flesh that had been barely holding together inside the sealed coffin, all of it now spread across the interior of the funeral carriage. Here's a detail that appears in multiple historical accounts. A detail so grotesque it seems almost too horrible to be true. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road. The man who claimed divine right to rule. The king who had executed thousands, who had destroyed anyone who opposed him, who had wielded absolute power over millions of people. He ended up as dog food on a country highway. The funeral procession couldn't continue until they had cleaned up the mess and reinforced the coffin. They added more wood, more seals, more layers of protection. But the damage was done. Henry's body had proven that even royal power couldn't prevent the laws of decomposition from having their say. When they finally reached Windsor Castle and tried to bury him, they encountered another problem. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin. But the ground kept collapsing because the soil couldn't support the weight of all that lead and wood and rotting flesh. It took multiple attempts just to get the king's remains into the ground and keep them there. Each time they lowered the coffin, the sides of the grave would crumble, forcing them to start over. The earth itself seemed to be rejecting Henry's corpse. Even after he was finally buried, the chaos continued. For years afterward, people reported strange noises and terrible smells coming from Henry's tomb. Some claimed it was his ghost, unable to rest because of all the evil he had committed in life. But historians think it was probably just more gases escaping from his continuously decomposing remains. The body that had been rotting for years while he was still alive wasn't going to stop just because it was finally underground. There's another detail that makes this even more horrifying. Several of the servants who handled Henry's body during the cleanup and burial died within weeks. The official cause was listed as various illnesses, but modern medical experts suspect they caught infections from contact with his rotting corpse. Even in death, Henry VIII was still killing the people around him. The autopsy that was conducted before burial revealed horrors that seemed to confirm every supernatural fear his subjects had whispered about. His internal organs were described as diseased and malformed. His heart was reportedly shrunken and blackened. His intestines were described as putrefied. The physicians who examined him were horrified by what they found. One doctor wrote that it was a miracle the body had sustained life for as long as it did. given that it contained not a single healthy organ. Henry VIII had spent his final years as a walking corpse, held together by sheer stubbornness and the remains of organs that should have killed him years earlier. His body had been failing for over a decade, slowly rotting from the inside out, but he had refused to die until every system had completely collapsed. The man who used absolute power to destroy lives, who executed wives when they displeased him, who murdered anyone who opposed his will, who claimed that God himself had chosen him to rule. That man ended his life as a bloated, rotting mass that exploded during its own funeral and had to be scraped off the road by disgusted servants while dogs licked up the remains. No amount of power, no claim of divine right, no executions or intimidation could save Henry from the ultimate humiliation of his own decomposing flesh. His body had been betraying him for years, and death gave it the final opportunity for revenge. The legacy of Henry VIII isn't just the Church of England or his 6 wives. It's not the political changes he forced through Parliament or the religious upheaval he created. His real legacy is a reminder that absolute power means nothing when your own flesh rebels against you. Henry spent decades wielding power over life and death, deciding who lived and who died based on his whims and paranoid delusions. But in the end, he couldn't control his own body, couldn't prevent it from rotting while he still lived, couldn't stop it from exploding after he died. The most powerful man in England, reduced to chunks of meat that had to be cleaned up with buckets while dogs licked the road. That's the real story of Henry VIII. Not a tale of royal majesty or divine kingship, but a horror story about what happens when flesh fails and power means nothing. His body betrayed him as dramatically as he had betrayed everyone around him. And unlike his wives and victims, his body got the last word. The final revenge came not from any human enemy, but from the simple biological fact that all flesh decays, no matter how royal it once was. That's the lesson Henry VIII taught in his death. Power is temporary, flesh is weak, and sometimes the most fitting end for a tyrant isn't a noble death in battle or a peaceful passing in sleep. Sometimes it's exploding in your own coffin and ending up as food for dogs on a country road. The king who once dazzled Europe with his athletic prowess, who married 6 women and executed 2 of them, who broke with Rome and created a new church, who wielded absolute power over millions. He died drowning in his own rotting flesh and then exploded into pieces that had to be mopped up by servants who were probably relieved he was finally, truly dead. That's not the Henry VIII of legend. That's not the powerful monarch of historical romance. That's the real Henry VIII, a cautionary tale wrapped in rotting flesh, sealed in a coffin that couldn't contain him, buried in earth that didn't want him. And that's exactly the legacy he deserved.